What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors stands up against a talk show host who pushed things way too far? In just 31 seconds, Stephen Colbert's smug smile would completely vanish as Denzel Washington delivered words that left the entire studio in absolute silence. This was supposed to be another easy interview. Another celebrity sitting down for some laughs and some promotion. But what Stephen Colbert didn't realize was that he was about to cross a line with the wrong person, and Denzel Washington was not going to let it slide. The stage was set like any other night. The lights were bright, the audience was excited, and Stephen Colbert sat behind his desk with that familiar grin on his face. Denzel walked out to huge applause. The crowd loved him. They always did. He waved, smiled, and sat down in the guest chair. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed fine. But you could feel something was different right from the start. There was a tension in the air that nobody could quite explain yet. Stephen started with his usual greeting, welcoming Denzel to the show. Denzel thanked him politely. Professional, respectful. Everything you would expect from someone like Denzel Washington. Then Stephen started asking questions about Denzel's latest movie. Standard stuff. What was it like working with this director? How did you prepare for the role? Denzel answered each question thoughtfully. He talked about the craft of acting. He talked about the responsibility of telling important stories. He was giving real answers. Meaningful answers. But Stephen seemed distracted. He kept interrupting. He kept trying to turn everything into a joke. Denzel would be in the middle of explaining something important about his character, and Stephen would cut him off with some sarcastic comment. The audience laughed, but you could see it in Denzel's eyes. He was being patient. He was being professional, but he wasn't happy about it. Then, Stephen decided to shift gears. He leaned back in his chair with this cocky expression and said, "So Denzel, you've been in this business for a long time. You've seen a lot of changes. Tell me, do you think actors today have it too easy?" It was a loaded question, a disrespectful question, and Denzel knew it. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think every generation faces their own challenges," he said. "The work is still hard if you do it right." But Stephen wasn't satisfied with that answer. He pushed harder. "Come on, though. You came up in a different era. You had to really prove yourself. These days, anyone with a viral video thinks they're an artist." The audience got quiet. This wasn't funny anymore. This was Stephen taking a shot at an entire generation of performers, and he was doing it while sitting across from a legend who had earned every bit of his success through decades of incredible work. Denzel stayed calm. "I think there's room for everyone," he said. "The industry is big enough for different kinds of talent." You could hear the class in his response. The dignity. He wasn't taking the bait. He wasn't going to trash other people just to make Stephen feel clever. But Stephen kept going. He actually kept going. "But you have to admit," Stephen said, leaning forward now, really committing to this ugly direction. "There's a difference between real actors and people who just show up and say lines because they look good on camera." The audience was completely silent now. Even they knew this had gone too far. Denzel sat there, and you could see him processing what was happening. This host, this person who invited him here, was being deliberately provocative. He was trying to get Denzel to say something controversial. He was trying to create a moment at Denzel's expense. Denzel took a breath. "I think that's a pretty narrow view of what it means to be an artist," he said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "And I think it's disrespectful to a lot of hardworking people." Stephen laughed. Actually laughed, like Denzel had just said something ridiculous. "Oh, come on. You know what I mean," Stephen said, waving his hand dismissively. "You're one of the greats. You can admit that the bar has been lowered." And that's when you could see it happen. That's when Denzel's entire demeanor shifted. He wasn't angry. He was something else. He was disappointed. disappointed that this was the level of conversation he was being subjected to, disappointed that this host thought so little of him and his colleagues. "The bar hasn't been lowered," Denzel said, his voice firm now. "What's been lowered is the respect that people in your position show to the people who create the art that you profit from talking about." The studio went dead silent. Steven's smile flickered. He tried to laugh it off, but it didn't work. The audience wasn't laughing with him anymore. Denzel had just called him out, and everyone knew it was deserved. But instead of backing off, instead of apologizing, Steven made the worst decision he could have made. He doubled down. "Wow, okay," he said, his voice dripping with fake amusement. "I didn't realize you were so sensitive about this." Sensitive. He called Denzel Washington sensitive, for standing up for his profession, for refusing to trash other actors, for maintaining his dignity in the face of deliberate disrespect. Denzel stared at him for a long moment, the kind of stare that makes you feel small, the kind of stare that makes you realize you've made a terrible mistake. "I'm not sensitive," Denzel said quietly. "I'm principled. There's a difference, and clearly, you don't understand that." Steven tried to move on. He tried to change the subject. "Okay, well, let's talk about something else," he said, shuffling his note cards. "Your character in the new film. He's a man who stands up for what he believes in, even when it's difficult. Do you relate to that?" The CDR irony was almost painful. Here was Steven asking Denzel about playing a principled character right after Steven had shown a complete lack of principles himself. Denzel saw it too. Everyone saw it. "I do relate to that," Denzel said. "I think it's important to stand up for what's right, even when the person across from you is trying to make you compromise your values for their entertainment." Another direct hit. Steven's face went red. He was losing control of his own show, and he knew it. The audience was completely on Denzel's side now. You could feel the shift in the room. This wasn't just an awkward interview anymore. This was a reckoning. Steven tried to regain control. "Look, I think you're reading too much into this," he said. "We're just having a conversation." "No," Denzel said, cutting him off. "You're trying to have a conversation where you get to be clever at other people's expense. That's not a conversation. That's you performing, and I'm not interested in being your prop." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sharp, clear, undeniable. Steven opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For once in his career, he had nothing to say. He had been completely dismantled by someone who understood the difference between confidence and arrogance. But Steven couldn't leave it alone. His ego wouldn't let him. After a few seconds of painful silence, he tried one more time. "I think you're being a little unfair," he said. "I've interviewed hundreds of people, and nobody has ever had a problem with my questions before." Denzel tilted his head slightly. "Maybe they were just more polite than honest," he said. "Or maybe you've never had someone sit across from you who wasn't willing to play along with whatever game you think this is." The audience gasped. Not a laugh, not applause. A gasp. Because they had just witnessed something rare. They had just watched someone refuse to be diminished by a person who thought their platform gave them the right to be dismissive. Steven's jaw tightened. You could see the anger in his eyes now. The mask was slipping. "You know what?" he said, his voice sharp. "If you didn't want to be here, you didn't have to come on the show." And that was it. That was the moment everything changed. Because Steven had just said the quiet part out loud. He had just revealed what he really thought. That Denzel should be grateful for the opportunity. That sitting in that chair was a privilege. That Steven was doing him a favor. Denzel stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. He just stood up, calm and composed, and started removing his microphone. The audience watched in stunned silence. The producers behind the cameras froze. Nobody knew what to do. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't supposed to happen. You're absolutely right, Denzel said as he carefully unclipped the mic from his jacket. I didn't have to come here, and I don't have to stay. Stephen's eyes went wide. The reality of what was happening finally hit him. Wait, what are you doing? He asked, and for the first time, his voice had no smugness in it. Just panic. I'm leaving, Denzel said simply. He placed the microphone on the chair and looked directly at Stephen. I came here to talk about my work, to have a real conversation. But you're not interested in that. You're interested in creating drama and making yourself look smart by making your guests look small. And I don't participate in that. Stephen tried to save face. Come on, Denzel, don't be like this, he said, attempting a casual tone that came out desperate. We're just talking. It's all in good fun. Denzel stopped and turned back to face him. It's not fun for me, he said, and it's not respectful. You invited me here, and then you spent the entire interview trying to get me to insult people I respect, trying to get me to agree with your cynical view of an industry I've dedicated my life to. That's not an interview. That's entrapment. The word entrapment echoed through the studio. It was the perfect description. Stephen had been trying to trap Denzel into saying something controversial, something that could be clipped and shared and turned into headlines. But Denzel had seen through it, and now he was walking away. Stephen stood up from behind his desk. Denzel, please, he said. The audience could hear the desperation now. This was a disaster, a complete disaster. One of the biggest stars in the world was walking off his show, and it was entirely his fault. But Denzel was done. I wish you well, he said with genuine politeness. But I'm not doing this. He turned and walked toward the exit. His posture was straight. His pace was steady. He wasn't running away. He was making a choice, a dignified choice. Stephen called after him. We can start over. We can talk about something else. His voice was pleading now. All the cockiness was gone. He was watching his show fall apart in real time, and he was powerless to stop it. Denzel paused at the edge of the stage, right before the curtain. He turned one last time. You don't get it, he said. This isn't about starting over. This is about basic respect. And you showed me tonight that you don't have that for your guests. So there's nothing to start over from. And with that, he walked through the curtain and disappeared. The audience sat in absolute shock. Nobody applauded. Nobody booed. They just sat there, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A legendary actor had just walked off a major talk show because the host had been so disrespectful that continuing the interview became impossible. Stephen stood behind his desk, his face pale. He looked at the audience. He looked at the cameras. He had no idea what to do. His producers were frantically talking in his earpiece. But what could they tell him? The guest was gone. The interview was over. The show was ruined. He tried to laugh. He tried to make a joke. Well, that was unexpected, he said, weakly. But nobody laughed. The audience just stared at him. They had seen everything. They had heard everything. And they knew exactly who was at fault. One of the producers finally called for a commercial break. The lights shifted. Stephen sat back down in his chair, and you could see him realize the magnitude of what had just happened. He had disrespected Denzel Washington, on camera, in front of millions of people. And Denzel had responded not with anger or insults, but with something far more powerful. Dignity. The cameras kept rolling during the break, catching Stephen with his head in his hands. The audience was still silent. Some people were whispering to each other. Others were pulling out their phones. This was going to be everywhere within minutes. A complete meltdown, a total humiliation. But here's the thing that made this moment so powerful. Denzel didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't make a scene. He simply refused to accept disrespect. He set a boundary and enforced it. He showed everyone watching that you don't have to tolerate being treated poorly, no matter who's doing it or what platform they have. When the show came back from commercial, Steven tried to recover. He made some awkward comments about the interview, not going as planned. He tried to move on to his next segment, but the energy in the room was completely dead. The audience was still processing what they had seen. The remaining guests could feel the tension. Everything felt wrong. Meanwhile, backstage, Denzel was already leaving the building. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam doors. He thanked the staff members who had helped him. He was professional until the very end. Because that's who he is. Someone who understands that maintaining your integrity isn't about making a scene. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. The interview had started like any other. Small talk, pleasantries, standard questions. But Steven had made a choice. He had decided to push, to provoke, to try and create a viral moment by getting under Denzel's skin. What he didn't anticipate was that Denzel Washington doesn't play those games. He doesn't compromise his principles for ratings. He doesn't insult his colleagues for laughs. And he doesn't sit quietly while someone disrespects him under the guise of entertainment. Every question Steven asked after those initial few had been designed to corner Denzel, to get him to say something controversial, to turn him into a headline. But Denzel saw through every single attempt. He answered with grace, with thoughtfulness, with class, until it became clear that grace and thoughtfulness weren't what Steven wanted. Steven wanted conflict. He wanted drama. He wanted Denzel to match his cynicism and his snark, but Denzel refused. And when refusal wasn't enough, when Steven kept pushing and kept disrespecting not just Denzel, but the entire profession, Denzel did the only thing that made sense. He left. The beauty of the moment was in its simplicity. There was no big argument, no shouting match, just a man standing up, removing his microphone, and walking away. It was powerful because it was calm. It was devastating because it was deserved. Steven had created this situation entirely on his own, and Denzel had simply refused to participate in it. Think about what that moment represented. Here was one of the most successful actors in history. Someone with nothing to prove, sitting across from a talk show host who thought he could treat him like a prop. And when that actor decided he'd had enough, there was nothing the host could do. No joke could fix it. No apology could undo it. The damage was done. The silence in that studio after Denzel walked off was louder than any applause. It was the sound of everyone realizing they had just watched someone's ego destroy what should have been a simple, respectful conversation. Steven had the opportunity to interview a legend, to have a meaningful discussion about art and craft and legacy. Instead, he chose to be smug. He chose to be provocative. He chose to prioritize his own cleverness over basic human decency. And Denzel showed everyone, that there are consequences for that choice. Not legal consequences. Not professional consequences in the traditional sense. But the consequence of being exposed. Of having your lack of respect revealed for everyone to see. Of losing the moral high ground so completely that you can't even pretend to have it anymore. The questions Steven asked weren't just rude, they were revealing. They showed what he really thought about actors, about artists, about the people who create the content that his entire career depends on discussing. He thought they were beneath him. He thought he was smarter than them. He thought he could manipulate them into saying what he wanted for his own entertainment. But Denzel didn't bend. Every attempt Steven made to get him to trash other actors, Denzel responded with respect for his colleagues. Every attempt to get him to be cynical, Denzel responded with sincerity. Every attempt to diminish him, Denzel responded with dignity. Until finally, when it became clear that dignity and sincerity weren't going to be met with the same, he removed himself from the situation entirely. That's leadership. That's strength. Not the performative kind of strength, where you have to prove yourself by dominating someone else. The real kind. The kind where you know who you are and what you stand for, and you don't compromise that for anyone. The cameras captured every second of it. Stephen's smug smile turning into confusion, then panic, then desperation. The audience's initial laughter turning into uncomfortable silence, then shock, then understanding. The moment when everyone in that room realized that what they were witnessing wasn't just an awkward interview. It was a masterclass in self-respect. Denzel's words were measured, precise. He didn't insult Stephen. He didn't attack him personally. He simply stated facts. You're trying to have a conversation where you get to be clever at other people's expense. That's not an insult. That's an observation, an accurate one. And the accuracy of it made it impossible to argue with. When Stephen tried to defend himself, tried to say that nobody else had ever had a problem with his questions, Denzel's response was perfect. Maybe they were just more polite than honest. Another observation, another truth. Because how many guests had sat in that same chair, smiled through the disrespect, and left feeling diminished? How many had played along because that's what you're supposed to do? How many had prioritized being a good guest over being true to themselves? Denzel wasn't willing to do that, and his refusal gave permission to everyone watching. Permission to set boundaries. Permission to walk away from situations that don't serve them. Permission to prioritize self-respect over politeness. The moment Stephen said, "If you didn't want to be here, you didn't have to come on the show," he revealed everything. He revealed that he saw the interview as a favor he was doing for Denzel, that he thought Denzel should be grateful for the platform, that he believed his show was more important than the people who appeared on it. But Denzel understood something Stephen didn't. The show needed guests more than guests needed the show, especially guests like Denzel Washington. People who have built careers on talent and hard work. People who don't need validation from a talk show host. People who can walk away and lose nothing of value. So he did. He walked away. And in doing so, he took all the power in that room with him. Stephen was left standing there, exposed and small, while Denzel exited with his dignity fully intact. It wasn't even close. It was a complete reversal of the dynamic Stephen had tried to create. Throughout the entire exchange, you could see the difference between someone who has earned respect and someone who demands it. Denzel never raised his voice, never lost his composure, never stooped to Stephen's level. He simply maintained his standards and refused to lower them. That's what made the walk-off so powerful. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was a deliberate choice made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Denzel had given Stephen multiple opportunities to course correct, multiple chances to shift the conversation into something more respectful. But Stephen kept pushing, kept trying to provoke, kept treating the interview like a game he was trying to win. And when Denzel finally stood up and removed his microphone, it was the quietest, most devastating statement imaginable. No words needed. The action spoke for itself. I don't accept this. I don't participate in this. I'm done. The studio audience understood immediately. You could see it in their faces. The shock, the respect, the recognition that they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't a celebrity throwing a tantrum. This was a professional setting a boundary and enforcing it with absolute clarity. Stephen's attempts to stop him only made it worse. Every plea, every come on, every desperate attempt to salvage the situation just highlighted how completely he had misread the room. He thought he could push Denzel around. He thought his platform gave him that right. He was wrong. The final moment, when Denzel paused at the curtain and delivered his last statement, was perfect. This isn't about starting over. This is about basic respect. And you showed me tonight that you don't have that for your guests. No anger, no vindictiveness, just a clear, calm explanation of exactly what had happened and why it was unacceptable. Then he was gone. And Stephen was left to face the consequences of his own choices. The dead silence, the awkward commercial break, the impossible task of continuing the show after such a spectacular failure. All of it entirely self-inflicted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a case of two people talking past each other. It was a case of one person disrespecting another until that other person decided they'd had enough. Simple as that. And the fact that it played out on national television, in front of cameras and a live audience, meant that everyone got to see exactly how it unfolded. There was no ambiguity. No, he said. The cameras caught everything. Stephen's provocations, Denzel's patient responses, the escalation, the final straw, the walk-off, all of it documented in real time, impossible to deny or reframe. What Denzel did in those 31 seconds after standing up sent a message that resonated far beyond that studio. He showed that success doesn't mean you have to tolerate disrespect. That being professional doesn't mean being a pushover. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remove yourself from a toxic situation. He didn't need to win an argument, didn't need to have the last word, didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to maintain his integrity. And he did. Completely. Utterly. Undeniably. While Stephen sat there, watching his show crumble, realizing too late that he had picked a fight with someone who didn't need to fight back. Someone who could simply walk away and leave him looking foolish all on his own.